Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, does a Buddha have any attachments?
This is a good question. The quick and conventional answer is no, he does not. However, at the same time, he has a noble calling to rescue all sentient beings. His entire life, his duty, his enlightenment, it is all pointed toward all of humanity. Is he attached to them? No, but he is irrevocably yoked and obligated to them.
What about if he has a family? The Buddha had 2 parents and a wife and a son. Does he not feel for them any more than any old stranger he meets on the road?
I have no doubt that having a family as he did made it all the more difficult for him to renounce, but his duty is to them just as much as it is to anybody and everybody else. What he did and accomplished was for them just as much as it was for the rest of all sentient beings. Thus, his family is, in a way, all of us and yet none of us.
Fascinating. May we all fulfill our obligations to each other.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Buddha's own son, Rahula. Who is Rahula? What role does he play in the texts? How does this role change over time? We hope you enjoy.
So, who is Rahula?
Rahula is the son of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni and his wife, Queen Yasodhara. He has a really interesting story because he was the son of Shakyamuni before he renounced and became the Buddha, and after this, Rahula actually became one of the Buddha's disciples. He was born to Yasodhara and Shakyamuni around the time that Shakyamuni left his life as a prince to go and be an ascetic and seek for enlightenment. And thus, he named his son Rahula because that name translates roughly to shackle or fetter. This name refers to the fact that the Buddha saw his son as an obstacle to the path of enlightenment. It was an attachment that must have been overcome. Most accounts say that Rahula spent his early childhood fatherless as the Buddha was off preaching and leading the community in its infancy. Later, when Rahula was about 12, it is said that the Buddha happened to be back in their hometown of Kapilavastu, and Rahula went to ask the Buddha for his inheritance. I say that in quotes because this is commonly interpreted as Rahula asking the Buddha if he could have the title of Prince of the Shakya clan, since the Buddha had renounced and wasn't ever going to rule the clan ever again. And the Buddha regarded it more symbolically, and in response, the Buddha ordained Rahula as the first novice monk. So the inheritance changed from the kingdom of Shakya to being all of the Dharma. A novice monk is usually a child or an entry-level monk who just takes the 10 precepts and then is fully ordained later in their career. Usually they have to do study and ritual in between, but they're much more of a children's-oriented type of position. I know many people who are novice monks simply because this is relatively easy to do. The only rules and vows that they have to take are to take refuge in the 3 jewels, which are the Dharma, the Buddha, and the Sangha, and they have to observe these 10 precepts, which we have talked about before. These are refraining from killing or harming any sentient beings, refraining from stealing, from sexual indiscretion, from lying, from taking intoxicants, from eating after noon, from singing, dancing, playing music, or attending entertainment programs, from wearing decorative accessories, from sitting on high chairs or sleeping on luxurious beds, and also from accepting any money. Rahula is mentioned in many of the later Pali texts and a lot of the post-canonical texts as well, and the picture they paint is that he was very eager to learn, such that he was named foremost in eagerness by his father, the Buddha. But his father's renunciation affected his personal life and his family life at every step of the way. For example, some accounts say that his mother and his grandfather tried to prevent him from encountering the Buddha whenever he returned to their hometown, but that Rahula couldn't help but hear about this famous teacher who was coming back to Kapilavastu. When he was ordained, his mother Yasodhara grieved for him, causing the king, Shakyamuni's father, Rahula's grandfather, to have to ask the Buddha that he at least get parental consent before ordaining children, because whenever they were ordained without parental consent, it usually made the parents very upset, and there was a lot of grief for the child being lost to the family. The Buddha is said to have taught Rahula directly in a one-on-one setting many times throughout his career, instructing him on meditation techniques, which Rahula had a little bit of trouble with at first. Rahula did eventually reach enlightenment and went on to outlive the Buddha. In outliving the Buddha, he became one of the 16 elders who was in charge of preserving the relics and the teachings of the Buddha, waiting for Maitreya to come. This function was meant to have the symbolic meaning of preserving the Dharma until the Buddha of the future comes back, but also the practical function of keeping the teaching and the relics secure until the Buddhist councils had had the chance to construct a written canon. In order to fulfill this function, the Buddha asked that these elders prolong their lives and stay in the world, not reaching nirvana until Maitreya came around and the Buddha's teachings and relics would be given to him in a ceremony right whenever the future Buddha reaches enlightenment. To that end, Rahula is said to still be alive somewhere with his 1,100 disciples in meditation until Maitreya comes back. He is named in several Mahayana lineages as a master or patriarch, including in the Chan, Tiantai, and Burmese lineages. There are some myths and stories about him that we will discuss later where pilgrims and historical figures claim to have met him at one time or the other, and he has a very interesting mythical function later in history, such that we don't even have a death account because he's supposed to still be alive. So his story is kind of still ongoing.
What role does he play in the texts?
There have always been a number of factors about the Rahula story that have struck me as controversial and fraught, while also being compelling in terms of the nature of the path of Buddhism. I should mention before I start speaking on this that every single moment of Shakyamuni's life, from birth to death, has been historically interpreted and commented on as a story, a narrative, a sermon in itself, that ought to be interpreted as such and mirrored as one seeks to attain enlightenment themselves. What's interesting about this is the contradiction involved in his life and the monastic rules. The fact that the Buddha had a son and a wife runs up against the monastic rules against having families. I think this contradiction is addressed by his son's name being Rahula or shackle, meaning that the message to students of the Buddha's life is that having children is a fetter or an obstacle to escape from samsara because they represent some of the most difficult attachments and difficult bonds to break. However, the contradiction runs deeper than that. The Buddha did not name him shackle and then leave him forever. He actually meets him later on and ordains him and brings him into the fold, and Rahula becomes one of the 10 foremost disciples and a protector of the Dharma. What does that say about the possibility of the path? What does that say about obstacles to the path? What does that say about the role of family in monastic Buddhism? What does that say about whether or not children can access the monastic path? Rahula's story brings up all of these interesting and important questions, and traditions interpret them differently over and over again. To summarize each of these questions to the best of my knowledge, I think that the story of Rahula's childhood and the renunciation of the Buddha speaks to the possibility and yet still the difficulty of the path. That is to say that the Buddha not only left a great deal of material wealth and a future and an obligation to his clan, but also he broke apart the most extremely important relationships a person can have so that he could do what he did for all sentient beings. I think that Shakyamuni's family is partially playing the role of playing up just how much the Buddha was willing to sacrifice and give up in order to do what he felt he had to do for all beings. That then speaks to the possibility of the path. Even if one has a royal title, a castle filled with wealth, and a fully grown family, they can still find enlightenment because the Buddha did. And that's just how powerful the mind that seeks enlightenment can be. If the mind that seeks enlightenment is cultivated and strengthened enough, it can overcome any obstacle, even baby daddy problems. As to the issue of family, I think that there is no rule that turns people away at the door to a monastery if they already have a family and they choose to renounce, but they are prohibited from sexual indiscretion or activity while they are ordained, which means that there is a divide between sexual indiscretion prior to ordination and during it. In other words, it does not matter what you did before becoming a monk as long as you take being a monk seriously while you do it. Obviously, we've talked about how this rule has been relaxed over time in the Mahayana to the point where some monks are allowed to have families. Finally, as the question of the accessibility of the path to children comes up, I think that Rahula's story demonstrates that as long as things are explained differently to them and taught in an easier fashion to them, and as long as they are taken through the novice stage first, then the path can absolutely be made accessible to them. Most schools of Buddhism allow ordination of children in this novice role and then offer them full ordination at age 20 after they've gotten some practice reading and reciting and copying sutras and wearing the robes and shaving their heads and taking alms and so on and so forth. They serve as apprentices to the fully ordained monks, and they also perform certain temple functions like cleaning up and preparing food and so on and so forth. And then later on, when they're adults, they become fully ordained monks.
So this is before the Buddha starts becoming an ascetic, right? Before he has the idea of the middle path at all.
That's right. He's married and has a child before he leaves, before he starts to, on the one hand, starve himself and then later indulge himself and then finally come to this idea of the middle path.
It makes sense that that's the trajectory a life would take. At what age at that time were families expected to start having children? I would imagine it was probably younger. And so, yeah, it makes sense. Just before he knew what he was doing, he ended up with a child, and you can't unhave a child.
Exactly. And he was being groomed for being the prince from his very birth. And so because of that, he was following that path that was laid out for him up until the very last moment when he had to throw it all away. And of course, like you say, part of that is having children at a certain age and so on and so forth.
Probably even more so important for royalty to have children.
Very much so. During this time period and in this culture, it was very normal for whenever a person achieved sexual maturity of some kind, they would, if they were royalty, have a harem and they would indulge and do all of that stuff and very likely father a lot of illegitimate children. However, in the case of the royalty, Yasodhara was also royalty. So it was slightly arranged, this marriage and this union, and it was auspicious that they actually had a son first, obviously, because then they had an oldest son who could inherit and so on and so forth. But then when he left, all of that was shattered because the sitting prince of the clan was giving up the entire kingdom for something else.
To in a row do that.
That's exactly right.
Like, that would be even more like, at this point, Rahula's grandfather, the Buddha's father, must be very annoyed at losing children to monastic pursuits.
He is, because he is strongly in favor of the Brahmanical scheme that we've talked about before, where you don't renounce until you're in your old age. By the time you're about 70 or so, that's when you're supposed to be pursuing spiritual enlightenment. While you're still an adult, you're supposed to be being educated, working, and then educating others, right? And so if you break up that scheme, then you're really violating the social norm, right? In Christianity, a comparable type of violation of the rules, of the unspoken social norms, would be something like living in a home together with your partner unwed, or it would be, of course, having a child out of wedlock, or it would be something of that nature. So his father struggles a lot in the text and looks upon what he's doing initially as being exactly everything he never wanted, because his father was trying to groom him from the start and prevent him from being a great spiritual teacher. He was born and a seer came to see him and said he's going to be a Chakravartin king, which is what his father wanted. He wanted him to be a great king, or he's going to be a great spiritual teacher. And he ended up being the spiritual teacher, and the father couldn't do anything about that. However, later on in the text, he comes back around because he sees the movement and the disciples, and he sees what the Buddha teaches and what he does and how he looks, and it makes all the difference. And he eventually becomes a supporter of Buddhism, and eventually I think someone does take over the Shakya clan. But the politics of it are kind of overshadowed by the story of the life of the Buddha.
Well, let's get back to Rāhula. So, how does Rāhula's role change over time?
As I mentioned before, Rāhula takes on a much more mythical form in later accounts because he's this interesting kind of immortal character. Since he is said to have prolonged his life until the arrival of Maitreya, which I should mention is billions of years away, there's a concrete number that's attached to it in the Pali Canon that I can't remember right now, but they're trying to start using astronomical numbers in order to make sense of when Maitreya is going to get back. But anyways, Rāhula has special powers. He's enlightened and he has these powers to make himself live longer, to prolong his life on Earth and put off his death. so that he can protect the Buddha's relics and teachings. Because of this, he's factored into several fun stories, because he's technically out there somewhere. Theoretically, you could go and find him and meet him. In the Chinese Mahayana Buddhist tradition, Rāhula is said to reside in a mythical land called Biliyangchu-zhou, which translates to land of chestnuts and grains. The famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim and translator Xuanzang, who we will have an episode about soon, is said to have met an Indian Brahmin in his travels in the 7th century Common Era, who claimed to have met Rāhula, confirming that he had prolonged his life to protect the teachings. But I should note that Rāhula is not an uncommon name in northern India at the time, and so this old Rāhula that this Brahmin guy saw could have been anybody. Similarly, because he was a novice monk when he was in his youth, Rāhula has become an object of veneration for novice monks, and is said to be a symbolic instructor of the novices. To use an analogy from Star Wars, I tend to think of Rāhula as Yoda. He's very old, he teaches the younglings, and he lives as a hermit. And he is scheduled to die when the next Jedi comes around. This change in how Rāhula is understood when his story makes it to China is likely influenced by Taoism, in which sagely humans are said to become immortals. The parallels between his story and that of a Taoist immortal are there, specifically with regards to him being able to prolong his life nearly infinitely once he has reached his enlightenment. There have been some cults of worship inside of larger traditions which have centered around the veneration of Rāhula, but those largely died out over time as Buddhism made its way from India to China to Korea to Japan and so on. Now he's worshipped as one of those 16 elders that I mentioned. The others of those 16 are not really well-known disciples that we would ever have encountered in the texts or that you would know if I said them, but they are important to venerative traditions in early Buddhist history. To that end, I think that Rāhula's role began as being an important plot point and teaching point in the legend of Shakyamuni, but it changed as he took on his own interesting mythical role outside of being the son of the Buddha. When we do an episode on Xuanzang, we'll find a lot of these interesting encounters that he has. Buddhist pilgrimage stories often have this mythos of an encounter between the pilgrim and a very important historical character, either as a ghost, as a stranger on the road, a character in a dream, a random little detour due to getting lost, or something like that. We'll talk a great deal more about that in future episodes, both on Xuanzang and on Buddhist pilgrimage.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on Rāhula, the Buddha's son. Join us next week where we will discuss Nichiren. Who is Nichiren? What were some of his views, works, and accomplishments? What is his significance to East Asian Buddhism? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.